Negotiation is the only humane path to ending war in Ukraine before more lives are lost, before Ukraine's ecology is beyond repair, and before further disaster. At a time when global cooperation is needed more than ever, we instead face risk of nuclear confrontation, and our taxpayers continue to pay the price. The time for peace is now. Join our campaign today.
Okay, nice and short and sweet. Thank you, Brian. Again, these are made for social media, so if you have accounts, social media accounts, we hope you will put these videos on. We have a set of 5 of them. This is the first one, and we have others that focus on the nuclear war danger, others that focus on how the war is contributing to ecological destruction, etc. All of them end up focusing on asking people to contact their members of Congress to push for negotiations as a much better path to peace in Ukraine and to peace in the world than the present path that we're on right now with the Biden administration. So later on, we can put the link to that in the chat somewhere at some point, right, Brian?
That's right. And we'll also send it in a follow-up email as well.
Yeah.
Not just that video, but all 5 of them.
Yeah, we'll send all of them out. Hopefully you can find one that would work best with your friends or with the groups that you belong to, or that you think will work best on social media. So let us begin our program tonight. On behalf again of the Ukraine campaign of Massachusetts Peace Action, I want to welcome everyone. And I'm actually going to start with the first paragraph of Stephen Kinzer's op-ed piece in the Boston Globe yesterday. Tremors from last week's political earthquake are shaking the world. Donald Trump does not emerge from the same political tradition as most Republicans and Democrats in Washington. Any other president-elect could have been relied upon to keep American foreign policy fundamentally unchanged. Trump is a wild card. The world may be in for some shocks. And we're very lucky tonight to have Stephen Kinzer himself with us to talk about some of those shocks that we might be in for and what the implications might be for us. Stephen Kinzer, of course, is an award-winning author and foreign correspondent who has covered more than 50 countries on 5 continents. His articles and books have led the Washington Post to place him, quote, among the best in popular foreign policy storytelling, unquote. He was Latin America correspondent for the Boston Globe and then spent more than 20 years working for the New York Times, with extended postings in Nicaragua, which many of us remember, Germany, and Turkey. He is a visiting fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. His numerous books include Overthrow, which I personally feel is an absolute must-read for people interested in understanding American foreign policy. And that was followed by All the Shah's Men, The Brothers, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, and Their Secret World War, The True Flag, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and the Birth of American Empire, and Poisoner in Chief. Stephen Kinzer is now a Boston Globe columnist, providing insight for all of us into U.S. foreign policy. Stephen, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
I guess it's a cliche when you start these speeches always to say what a pleasure it is to be here, but I really have to say I mean that very seriously in this circumstance. I'm a great admirer of Massachusetts Peace Action, and I'm just thrilled that I'm able to do anything to contribute to the great causes that you all are working on. So it's an honor for me to be with all of you. Let me start by telling you briefly some things that you all already know. This election turned out to be a terrible choice. I don't even need to say anything about Trump. We all have gone through that, and we're going to see so much of him you don't want to hear anymore. There's nothing I can tell you that you don't already know. On the other hand, the Democrats were singularly disappointing, if you had any hopes in them at all. There was a time during the Vietnam period when Democrats were thought of as being the peace party. That's long gone. The Democrats are captured by a small elite that proposed Kamala Harris just the way the Soviet Politburo used to work. Nobody ever voted for that person. She didn't have time to introduce herself, and I'm not sure she had much to introduce. I thought the real turning point for Kamala was when she was asked on one of those gentle TV shows that were the only ones she would go on, what do you think you're going to do differently from Biden? And she said, I can't think of a single thing. When I heard that, I thought, okay, election is over. It's just like the election when Trump beat Hillary, in the sense that in both cases, America was at a moment when people really want to change. They're frustrated with the establishment. So what do the Democrats do? Nominate the most establishment candidate they can possibly find. It was a loser from the beginning. I don't think Kamala ever proposed a concept for how she would govern, even domestically, much less internationally. Everything was, it's going to be just the same. If you liked Biden, there's going to be a new Biden, second term, and it's going to be me. That was the wrong message for this moment. And only the totally out of touch Democrats could have believed that this message was going to resonate with Americans. So I guess being disgusted with the Democrats is nothing new. But in this case, I think they reached a new low. And one thing that's for sure in the wake of this election, just based on everything we've seen going back to the Hillary Clinton defeat and before, is that the Democrats are not going to be reflective. The Democrats are not going to look in the mirror and say, maybe we've done something wrong. Well, maybe it was our fault. It's got to be somebody else's fault. I haven't heard anybody blaming Susan Sarandon for this one yet, but it's something like that. We've got to find other culprits. I'm old enough to remember when, I think it was the first election that I can remember as a child, and it was the 1968 election between Nixon and Humphrey. I remember that, 1968, and I was at that crazy Democratic convention in Chicago where tear gas was being shot by the Chicago police and people were being beaten. The whole genesis of that was that the two peace candidates, Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy, were not there. One was dead. The other had been voted out by the Humphrey people. And after that convention, there was intense pressure from what we would now call progressives for Humphrey to break with the Vietnam policy of Johnson. Make a speech and say, when I'm in, it's not going to be like it's up to now. It's going to be different. I'm going to stop that war in Vietnam. But he couldn't do that because he was captured by Johnson and the Democratic Party. The same thing happened this time. I don't know if Kamala ever really thought deeply about world affairs or if she had any unusual views, but all I know is she was given index cards more or less by the Democratic National Committee, and she had to say, yes, I support everything they're doing. Whatever they're doing, she could not even summon up a little bit of compassion for the victims in Gaza. It was awful, really. And I can see why people felt that they couldn't vote for Kamala based on what was happening, particularly in Gaza. This election campaign also highlighted, like all our campaigns do, the system of legalized bribery that we call American democracy. So you had Elon Musk gives $100 million to Trump. Miriam Adelson gives $100 million. There's no other developed country that calls itself democratic that allows this. You know, I lived in Germany for years. Helmut Kohl fell from power when it was found out that he had accepted money from a company for his political campaign. Out of the question. You're out of power. We are the exact opposite. So I want to go back to a quote that I used to like, but I think it's more contemporary than ever. When I was a college student at BU, I concentrated in studying colonial American history, the federal period and the period preceding it. So I want to read you a quote from John Adams, our second president, great Massachusetts citizen born just down the road in Quincy. Here's John Adams. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. It is in vain to say that democracy is less vain, less proud, less selfish, less ambitious, or less avaricious than aristocracy or monarchy. It is not true, in fact, and nowhere appears in history. Those passions are the same in all men under all forms of simple government, and when unchecked, produce the same effects of fraud, violence, and cruelty. Now, those are the effects that we're seeing right now. So this is not something that was completely unpredictable. We've actually watched, many of us in our own lifetimes, the decline of this political system. I remember being taught in high school that the two greatest contributions the United States ever made to the world were jazz and the Constitution. I still think jazz is a great thing. The other one, not so sure. It was nice for the 18th century, maybe into the 19th, but in many ways it's outmoded. Our political system has not been able to resist capture by a wealthy elite through the manipulation of our different branches of government. So we are in a perplexing situation, and I'm trying to find some possibilities for how we might, how these next years might unfold. I think a great deal depends on something that's going to happen in the next few weeks, which is Trump's decision on who to appoint to key national security positions. It's sometimes said personnel is policy. And in this case, I think that's true because the guy at the top, Trump, doesn't really have any policy except for a few slogans and cliches. So the people he appoints are going to be particularly influential. Now, you probably saw, I believe it was just yesterday, a tweet from Trump in which he announced that neither Nikki Haley nor Mike Pompeo will be serving in this Trump administration. Well, that was fantastic news. When I read that Pompeo was at the Madison Square Garden rally for Trump, my heart sank. But now he's out, and Nikki Haley is out. We don't know who's in yet. We've heard news that Brian Hook, the great Iran hawk, might be brought back for this administration with the maximum pressure on Iran policy, but that's not sure yet. Now, the big decisions coming up will be who's going to be the national security advisor, who will be the Secretary of Defense, and perhaps most important, who's going to be the Secretary of State. You've all seen the same names that I have floating around. A lot of them are people that we don't know because we're just not in that environment. One name that I found kind of interesting, which I consider to be quite a long shot, is Tulsi Gabbard. I always admired her. I liked her when she ran 4 years ago for president. She's taken quite a journey since then. On the other hand, she still believes in ending foreign wars, as she has outspokenly said. I think, let's put it this way. I've been told that Tulsi Gabbard was partly responsible for that Trump tweet saying there's not going to be any Nikki Haley and there's not going to be any Mike Pompeo. If that's true, then she's done a great service to America. I think it's really a long shot that somebody who's that far out of the Democratic Republican consensus on foreign affairs would be appointed to such a high position. Maybe she'll get another job as Secretary of Veterans Affairs or some other job where she'll have Trump's ear. I did notice that Trump's daughter has some name that starts with an I can't keep them all straight, actually endorsed on Twitter Tulsi Gabbard for Secretary of State. I don't know if she talks to Dad. But though I would say watching who gets those top jobs will give you a great insight into what's going to happen next. And will also help you decide whether Trump is the same person he was last time, who claimed to be anti-establishment, but actually was the establishment's greatest donor and benefactor. Or is this time he really is going to try to rebel against the establishment? I don't think anybody knows, and I don't even think he knows. So let's try to spool ahead of what we might see. To me, Trump's two worst foreign policy decisions were to end two of President Obama's great foreign policy achievements. In fact, I think his two greatest. And that was opening up relations with Cuba and signing the nuclear accord with Iran. So Trump trashed both of those. And that's had terrible effects. In Cuba, it's been awful. The Cuban economy has now crashed. They're having nationwide blackouts. And something like more than 15% of the Cuban population has fled. And half of them are basically going to Nicaragua and walking up through Mexico to come to the United States. So we can lament that they're coming in the United States and causing a refugee crisis when we're actually the ones that provoked them to leave in the first place. I don't think Trump is able to follow all of that, and possibly still captured by the idea that he has to placate the Cubans in Miami. This possibility that I've seen mentioned of Marco Rubio becoming Secretary of State is absolutely terrifying, certainly for Cuba, but also for the rest of the world. Iran is another real unknown. We know that Trump is very much a prisoner of the Israel lobby, and I think a very willing prisoner. Those large donors would like him to see eye to eye with Netanyahu on Iran, and I think, as far as Netanyahu has said, they do. What that's going to produce is hard to say. So I do believe that neither the United States nor Iran really wants to get into a war with each other, but Israel would like them to get into a war with each other. And depending on how much impact the Israel lobby will have inside the Oval Office, and depending on Trump's feeling at a certain time on a certain day, Iran could come back into the crosshairs for Washington. It would be logical, if you want to support the Israeli view, to see Iran as a huge enemy. This fantasy is very powerful in Washington. I saw Senator Blumenthal last week saying, Iran has said it wants to destroy the United States. I want to raise my hand and say, when and where did they ever say that? And of course, Kamala Harris, when asked in an interview what she thought was the greatest threat to the United States, didn't say China, Russia. She didn't say climate change or a nuclear war. She said the greatest threat to the United States is Iran, which essentially is a second-rate, hollowed-out regional power in the Middle East that has no interest in threatening the United States, although it does threaten American interests in the Middle East. At one point during his last presidency, Trump threatened to bomb what he called Iran's cultural monuments. He said something like, you think you can behave, do whatever you want, and you still keep your cultural monuments? No. This is pretty horrifying. You know, Alexander the Great about halfway destroyed Persepolis, the old Persian royal capital. If the other half is still standing, is Trump going to be the next Alexander the Great? If he follows what Netanyahu wants, maybe he will. So I'm fearful for Iran, but I do have a little asterisk and a footnote at the bottom of my fear. I'm going to posit something that I think is very unlikely, but not impossible. Trump likes to think of himself as a deal maker. And I think this is something that gives us hope. With Biden, there were no deals. Everybody was the enemy. They're autocrats. They're dictators. We're against them. We hate them. I can fantasize, and my fantasy life is rich, so it doesn't have so much to do with reality, that Trump might say to his Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, you know, I'd like to make some big deal somewhere in the world. I want to pull a rabbit out of a hat and shock everybody and try to show that I can really make a deal that nobody else could make. Where would that place be where I could do that? If I were the person answering that question, I'd say Iran. Iran has a population that's much more like the United States than the population of any other country in that region. Iranians are more pro-American than the people in any country in the Middle East by far. There are strategic reasons for the United States to develop a good relationship with Iran. And actually, in the long run, if you put aside ideology, which is sometimes difficult to do, Iran and Israel could go back to being the partners that they were for many years. So there's a deal, a breakthrough deal to be made out there. Whether Trump will go that far, it's difficult to imagine because of his ties to the Israel lobby. He would have to rebel against them. So I don't see that as likely, but I see it as a remote possibility. As far as Gaza goes, this is one issue where I don't think I see any difference between Trump and Kamala Harris. Both of them seem to think that it's fine what's going on in Gaza. Israel should go ahead and do whatever they want and just keep doing everything they've been doing that has made us vomit when we saw those pictures every single day for the last year. Trump's advice to Netanyahu about Gaza was do what you have to do. I hate that. And I think this has just been a horrible century to be a Palestinian, and I fear that that will continue to be the case with Trump. I don't see him trying to discipline Israel at all. Let's move to the other active combat theater in the world now, and that is Ukraine. Here I see things differently. Here I do believe that there's the prospect for a real change. It's quite bizarre that we're now relying on sort of half-crazed extremist Republicans to rescue us from war. You know, I had a lunch with one of our great heroes who just spoke in Boston over the weekend, Medea Benjamin from Code Pink. And she told me about her experience these days lobbying in Congress. And she says, it's so crazy. I go to the liberal Democrats, they throw me out of the office. They don't even want to talk to me. But I'm best friends with Marjorie Taylor Greene. So you talk about strange bedfellows. The Republicans have a small militantly anti-war caucus. Democrats don't have any such caucus. And as I said earlier, I don't see them reflecting and asking themselves what went wrong and trying to see if they can change the Democrats' approach to the world. So in Ukraine, I think common sense will take hold. It's not going to be some brilliant new Trump policy. It's just going to be the policy that any rational person who wasn't completely carried away with ideological fantasies would have been following all along. I mean, Joe Biden could have prevented this whole war by simply getting up and uttering one sentence: Ukraine is not going to join NATO. But he couldn't do that. And as a result, Ukraine is being wrecked. The horrors there are just too much to contemplate. All unnecessary. So I think Trump sees that. I think he also is close enough to reality to realize that Russia is advancing. All you have to do is look at the news. Every week they're a little further west. Ultimately, this war will be ended with a ceasefire, and then there'll at some point be a ceasefire line. That ceasefire line is going to be determined by wherever the Russian troops are at that moment. So the best thing for the Ukrainians is to stop the war so that what they're going to lose in territory is less. But instead, they're continuing it, digging themselves into an ever deeper hole, presuming that the Americans will come and rescue them. Now, I've already noticed in the last week that the narrative on Ukraine is starting to change. You start to see stories in the American press about how Russia is really advancing, and Ukraine is having a real hard time recruiting soldiers and repelling Russian advances. I just saw a clip yesterday from a recently retired top official of the European Union, and he said, I can't believe what I'm hearing at the EU, which is we got to find a way to try to end the war in Ukraine. Up until the time of the American election, this was a completely taboo thing to say in any EU meeting. You could not bring up the idea of ending the war. Now, just within the last week, I hear people at the EU, they're talking about it now. Look at Scholz, the chancellor in Germany. He was another one of these as long as it takes people. And like the Germans and all the other NATO members, they're just poodles for the United States, so they're just following what we tell them to do. Scholz now says he'd like to see Ukraine Finlandized, like Finland was during the Cold War, kind of a neutral country like Austria that doesn't allow any foreign troops on its territory. Scholz would never have said that even a week ago. So I do see the taboos falling away and rationality slowly taking hold. The only other option is to keep the war going just indefinitely forever. And that's just senseless slaughter. I don't think Trump feels there's any national interest for the United States in Ukraine, which there isn't. I think he realizes that Ukraine will always be far more important to Russia than it is to the United States. And I don't think Trump is captured by this fantasy that the way to see the world is as a conflict between the democratic countries that are the good guys and the autocracies that are the bad guys. I don't think he sees the world that way. And I think that's good. So I'm anticipating some real change in our policy toward Ukraine. At the very least, you're not going to get that stomach churning line we got from Biden, as long as it takes. Shouldn't do anything for as long as it takes. I don't like the word ironclad either. The United States should not, or any country, should not have ironclad alliances with anybody. We should be following our own interests and not subcontracting our foreign policy to other countries. So I do think that rationality is taking hold in Washington about Ukraine. I think that if Trump tries to cut off funding for Ukraine, he's going to find a lot of pushback in Congress. He might be able to beat some of the Republicans down because they're so afraid of him. The Democrats will then show again that they are the party of all war all the time and try to block him from ending that war. And I think that will just whet his appetite. So I am looking forward to more change for the better in our policy toward Ukraine than I foresee in our policy toward Israel and Gaza. The other country that America is so concerned about is China, of course. I'm not sure that Trump will go through with his policies of across-the-board tariffs. Trump is also a person who, as I said earlier, thinks of himself as a deal maker. The Chinese are the ultimate deal makers. I don't think that Trump is wedded to the Taiwan project. I think he believes in the one China policy, which Biden basically didn't. I don't think he wants to send more weapons to Taiwan. I don't anticipate friendly relations between the US and China, although based on reality, there's no reason why those shouldn't exist. And I think China is a place where it's the biggest wild card for Trump. A lot depends on who he's going to choose. And China is one situation that Trump can't manipulate so easily. He can manipulate the situation in Gaza if he wants to. He can change it if he wants to. Same thing is true with Ukraine. But that's not true in China. China's not like Ukraine or Gaza or Israel. China's the big emerging power in the world. And I think Trump doesn't feel that he has to resist that. Here, I think, might be one of the deeper differences between Trump and the Democrats. And that is that the Democrats are fanatically devoted to the idea of American primacy. They feel that the United States has to have hegemony over the whole world and has to slap down the countries that will not submit to American leadership. I don't think Trump feels that way. I have a sense that he doesn't really care. Countries can go their own way. He doesn't feel like if the wrong party is admitted into the government of Syria, we're bombing Syria or something like that. Let them do what they want to do. He doesn't feel like America's vital national interests are at stake every day in every country in the world. That's so different from the old group that we're now bidding farewell to with no regrets. I thought that Anthony Blinken was just an absolutely terrible Secretary of State. It says it all that at Halloween he dressed his two kids up. He dressed his son up as Zelensky, and his daughter was dressed up in the Ukrainian flag. He made 15 trips to Israel. He wasn't able to make Israel's policy change one iota. There was no diplomacy during the Biden administration. Blinken had a diplomacy-free foreign policy. There were no diplomatic initiatives. There were no attempts to resolve crises through diplomacy. It's like the State Department didn't even exist. And I think this is going to be one of the key challenges for the new Secretary of State. Reorient the State Department back to being what it's supposed to be, which is the center of our diplomacy. I heard J.D. Vance say diplomacy is not a bad word. And that shouldn't be a shocking statement. That should be something everybody would agree with. But in the climate in Washington today, it's very suspicious. I actually think that Vance's emergence might be the most important long-term effect of this election. Vance is quite likely going to emerge as the future of the Republican Party. If that's true, his skepticism about American foreign policy is going to have a big effect. Vance is the first veteran of the global war on terror to reach a position of national leadership. Many of us know people that fought in those various theaters of war, and all the ones I know are completely disgusted with what they were sent to do. They saw it and they hate it. And so I think having a veteran of that misbegotten conflict in positions of power could be quite interesting. Again, I go back to this odd situation like Medea Benjamin sitting with Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm asking myself all the time, how can it be that people in the Republican Party with whom I share views on world affairs are the same people that want everyone to have a gun, want to ban abortion, and think Trump won the last election? It's really a bizarre situation that we're in now, but I think you have to meet people where they are, and I want to welcome anybody who has those views. Trump has already, in his last election, in his defeat of Hillary Clinton, done two great services to America. Number one, he killed the Bush dynasty. We could still be living under a Bush. Thanks to Trump, that's never going to happen again. Number two, he killed the Clinton dynasty. there would be another Clinton in Congress right now, and they'd be talking about her as a possible presidential candidate. That's over thanks to Trump. So I consider those to be great triumphs where he, like, what do they do with vampires? You have to stab them through the heart and then put garlic on them or hold a big cross over them. It worked. I would love to see Trump be able to do that to the shell of the Democratic Party that's still out there cheering for wars. So I guess the final conclusion is that this is a very mixed bag, and what's going to happen in the next few weeks will be very important. So what does that mean for all of us? Well, first of all, I think it's important for us to take this not only as a super depressing blow, but also look at it for its possibilities. I mean, it's there, so we have to deal with it. My own gut feeling is that Trump is going to be quite bad for America, but he might not be so bad for the world. We don't know yet. That's a little bit more hopeful. So the Democratic Party is now really at loose ends. The policy that has guided their last three nominees, Hillary, Biden, and Kamala Harris, has failed. I think we have a possibility now to try to reorient the Democratic Party towards what its base really wants, and we are its base. I also think that an organization like Mass Peace Action is very important because this process of trying to reorient the Democratic Party is not going to work in Washington. It's only going to work out in the states. And those states are going to be having more and more impact on the party. We have to rebel against the oligarchy in our party of Nancy Pelosi and the Clintons and Obama and Jim Clyburn and Chuck Schumer and those people. You're not going to be able to do that in Washington, but you can do it out here. And I think that's a great call for activism. If the Democrats were in power, they'd be so smug, there'd be no possibility for any of us to tell them they're on the wrong path. But Americans have told them that they're on the wrong path. And now we are the ones who can help find a new path, a more peaceful path, and a path that will lead us away from the confrontations that have grown so horrific in the last couple of years. So I think this election for activists actually can be something very positive, a call to action, maybe in a negative sense. It started in a negative way, but I think it opens up a lot of opportunities because people who are the leaders of the Democratic Party cannot fail to realize that they had an election that was theirs to win, and they lost it. So we have some other ideas. Maybe people in power are a little more willing to listen to us as we take over Democratic town committees and Democratic state committees around the country. And I want to just conclude with this observation. So we're living in a period that can be very depressing. You know, I had a breakfast a few months ago with a guy who wants to run for president, Ro Khanna. And he told me that in my speeches, what I tell people is life and American politics is a cycle. And maybe in the future, people will be looking back on the 2020s and say that was a really low period for American democracy. But then we rose up again. I think that's what he has to say if he wants to be positive as a presidential possible candidate. But I also think it might be true that actually we're in a cycle and we're at a low part of the cycle, and it's our job to be sure that the next part of the cycle emerges. And finally, I have to say one thing about how I'm able to maintain my modicum of optimism and hope despite everything that's unfolding around us. So, as some of you know, I'm a college professor. I have students in my office every day, and I'm teaching to large classes. This is really a very motivating experience. when you're 20 years old and in college, you can't be a nihilist. You can't think, the future is all black and there's no possibility, there's no hope, so I'm not going to do anything. People of our age are maybe a little bit more likely to succumb to that position. But kids can't. And I'm telling you, they are bubbling over with ideas, how they're going to activate their local communities, how they're working on technologies that are going to address the effects of climate change. They've got 100 ideas. They're positive. They're bubbling. And they're not depressed. They're out there. And that really gives me some hope. I feel that the depression that us superannuated people have a reason to feel isn't shared so much by young people. Those are the young people that are the base of the Democratic Party, the base that the Democratic Party has been studiously ignoring all this time. So I see a vibrancy and an excitement that I think in part is the result of this last unfortunate election campaign. So on foreign policy, on the way the United States addresses the rest of the world, I think we could be at a turning point. I especially think that's going to happen in Ukraine. I'm looking forward to some kind of negotiated end to that war. Maybe that will spread to other places. That will depend in part on the people that Trump chooses. So I would say keep your eyes open. But also don't mourn, organize. With that, I think I'll end it and ask if any of you has any comment or question.
Okay, Stephen, thank you so much for that, for all those ideas and things for us to look at. I think there's a lot of questions out there. Before we get to that, given how serious and dangerous and downright depressing the situation in Gaza is right now, Mass Peace Action is really focusing a tremendous amount of its energy to try to end that war, to try to get a ceasefire, to get aid into people living in Gaza, to cut off weapons for the Israeli assault. And Brian has a little urgent action that we can all take very, very briefly here. Brian?
Thanks, Paul. So as many of you might know, but if not, I'll explain the process to you. At the end of September, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont introduced a privileged resolution. This is called a joint resolution of disapproval, or JRD, as you might hear us refer to it. This is in opposition to proposed weapons sales to Israel of about $20 billion. Most of that is in the form of these high-tech F-15 fighter bombers that are being used to destroy Gaza and parts of Lebanon. They also include things like tank and mortar shells that have been used to pummel Palestinians now for well over a year. And Senator Sanders introduced this, and the fact that it's privileged means that he can get around all efforts to pigeonhole a resolution like this, and he can bring it to the floor of the Senate and make sure that every member of the Senate goes on the record as to whether they oppose these particular weapons sales. Now, this is unusual. Usually, efforts like this can be pigeonholed and they never get a vote. And as we know, and as I'm sure Stephen will tell you, Congress people don't like having to go on the record on issues of war and peace. They'd much rather not suffer the blame for when things go wrong. This is an exception to that. So we've had well over 50 organizations in Massachusetts sign a letter in support of this, trying to get our senators Markey and Warren to vote yes and publicly support this joint resolution of disapproval. So far, they've been unwilling to co-sign it, co-sponsor it, or announce their public support for it. But there's efforts all across the country, just like ours, to get as many senators on board with this, to say not only do they support a ceasefire in some undefined way, but specifically they oppose the weapons that are creating the destruction, the ethnic cleansing, the genocide in Gaza, and the destruction of a big part of southern Lebanon. So I just put a link in the chat. You can easily send messages to your members of Congress saying that you expect them to vote yes on this and that you oppose this genocide. And that'll really help us because on Wednesday, we're going to be delivering the letter with over 50 organizational signatures to Markey and Warren. And if their email inboxes get flooded, that'll really back us up and we can point to it and say, we know your constituents have been sending you messages on this. It takes about 30 seconds. You put your address in, you can personalize it if you want, but it will give us a lot of backup. I do think we can get Markey and Warren, just speaking from the Massachusetts perspective, to vote yes on this, but only if we pressure them. So any pressure that you can provide will be very helpful. It's very quick and easy too.
Let me add one comment to what you just said, Brian. So I mentioned that I was lucky enough to have lunch with Medea Benjamin over the weekend. So I asked her, what are you spending your time doing these days? And she said, well, we're focusing on Congress. We meet every morning with the group and we decide where we're going, which members of Congress we're going to lobby and what we're going to lobby them on. So I said, well, what are you lobbying them on now? She said, well, now it's all about Sanders' resolution, the one you just referred to. She said, we go from office to office and we're asking all the senators to sign on to this. And she also told me something interesting, which I think is kind of encouraging for people like us. She said, you know, we get a lot of doors slammed in our face. A lot of senators say no, and this thing is not going to pass. It's just important for us to try to get senators on the record and make a little progress. But whenever we go into an office to talk to a senator or a senator's aides, some staffer will usually run out after us and say something like, I'm really sorry my boss isn't good on this issue, but I love what you're doing. Keep it up. And she told me, we go down at lunch. We have lunch in the cafeteria in the Capitol downstairs. She said, it never, every single time, while we're sitting for lunch, we have our pink shirts on. Some staff member will come over and say, oh, we love what you're doing. Keep it up. So these are people who are working for senators that refuse to sign this bill, but the staffers are for it. So it shows you're seeding the ground for the future. And I think it's not just her in Washington, but it's us out here in the states where those senators have to look for votes.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Brian. And so all people have to do is click that link in the chat that Brian put in there. It'll open up this letter for you. You just fill in your name and everything, and it sends it off automatically. It's like magic. Just take, if people could just take 20 seconds to do that right now, and we'll come back, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions for Stephen in just a few seconds.
Yep. Thanks in advance, everyone, for doing that. And what Stephen said is true when he said, seeding the future. Those staffers, some of them will become future members of Congress. That's how the pipeline works. So, when we say a free Palestine in our lifetime, this is a life's work. People have been working on this for decades. We're going to need to keep this up for decades and generations to come. So if we can convince those future leaders now to take stands, we've already seen this issue that was once untouchable start to gain a lot of traction. People are willing to oppose Israel and their apartheid policies and their genocidal policies openly, and providing pressure to members of Congress and their staff is a big part of that. So we appreciate what you can do for us.
Okay, well, that's great. Hopefully, everyone who agrees with this joint resolution will sign that, and let's get on to questions now. The way to ask a question is the same old system. You go to the React menu item at the bottom of your screen, you click on it and you raise your hand, and we'll try to take a bunch of questions here. Maybe, we'll see how many we can get in before like 8:15 or so. Is that okay, Stephen?
Sounds good.
Okay, good. So let's start with Anatol Zuckerman. Brian will unmute you.
You should be good to go,
Yeah,
Anatole. You appear to be unmuted.
you just muted yourself again, Anatole. Okay, go ahead.
I think it might be something on Anatole's side. While we figure out the technology, you want to go to the next
Yeah,
person, and
sure.
I'll reach out
Let's
to you via chat directly, Anatole.
great. Let's go to Moshe Yaga.
Hi, do you have my voice?
Yes, we do.
Oh, great. Hi. And Dr. Kinzer, this is Moji from the Mossadegh Legacy Institute. Do you remember me?
I always remember everything that has to do with Mossadegh.
Well, thank you. Anyhow, we were on a radio show. You were the next guest. I was the previous guest, and you asked I had 2 minutes. You said, can you tell us how Iran is going to evolve? And I joked. I said, you want me to do it in 2 minutes? Anyhow, first of all, it's wonderful seeing you. And I'm doing something called peace-seeking Iranian veterans in order to provide citizen diplomacy space, track 2 or track 2.5, a beginning talking. I'm a member of, associate member of Veterans for Peace, in order to be able to have direct live conversations between peace-seeking American and Iranian veterans. And first of all, I would love to have you as a very special guest. So I've sent in the chat the link to this. But my comment, and then of course I look forward to your reflections. Inside Iran, there are people who in a sense are millennialists. They want an Armageddon war of some kind. Therefore, they're working with the Israeli. I mean, maybe not directly, but they are supposedly enemies, but they are in the same camp, if you will, as enemies with Israeli millennialists and the American millennialists in the Christian Zionist churches. And that's something by the way, they are very happy that Trump has been elected, this crowd. So I just wanted to kind of depress your little optimism. And I am fearful for my family. My hometown is Natanz, Iran, where Iran's enrichment facility is. So if Netanyahu urges Trump to have a limited nuclear attack, my family will be vaporized. Anyhow, I am all ears for your comments. Thank you.
Well, that's very sobering. I think you're right that the option of like a limited strike, they would just bomb a few cities and just vaporize, a few thousand families instead of a few million. That's considered to be some kind of a reasonable compromise. I think you're right that there are people in Iran that would welcome confrontation, just like there are in Washington. We have people in Washington. I mentioned Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley. Those are like the Ayatollahs. They're the ones that would love to see these two countries fight, so one of us can be a winner and destroy the other one. I actually think that the reason that Iran has not been more militant and has not built a nuclear weapon is the supreme leader, Khamenei. A lot of people are thinking, see, he's old, maybe he's sick, and if he dies, there'll be kind of a renovation and everything will change for the better. I have a feeling that it might be the opposite. There are people around Khamenei and people in the Iranian security apparatus that don't like what he's doing. They don't like the fact that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. They blame him for this. They don't like the fact that Iran is not making direct war on Israel. They blame him for this. Those are people that are poised to come into power next. Then you have this radical group of diaspora Iranians in the United States, gathered in part around the Shah's son, and they're very pro-Israel. So if you want to find people that are interested in Armageddon in Iran, you can find them both in Washington and in the United States. You're absolutely right also that a big change has happened in the Israel lobby in the United States. It wasn't that long ago that the Israel lobby was Jewish. That's not true anymore. The real lobby supporting Israel in America now, it's the Christian Zionists, it's the Christian evangelicals. And they are people who have a theological belief that there has to be some kind of tremendous explosion in the Middle East and everybody will die and then there'll be the second coming. And these kind of crazy theologies have a terrible effect on policy. So I hope that Trump, as a person who doesn't believe much in theology, will be able to resist that.
Thank you, Stephen. And thanks, Moji. Let's try to see if Anatole is able to ask his question now.
Go ahead, Anatole. You are still unmuted from our end. Give it a try. See if we can hear you. Yeah, I see your mouth moving, but I can't hear you. You may try signing out and signing back in. Give
Sorry.
that a whirl and see if
That's-
it works for
That's
you.
too bad. We'll try to get you in still, Anatole, if we can figure this out. Let's go to Jeffrey Bachtel. Jeffrey?
There, hey there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. You know, there's something you forgot to mention in your speech, in what you just said, and I want to have a follow-up question with that. You forgot to mention Project 2025 because that's what worries me more than that, more than anything else. And I'm worried that Project 2025 if he goes too far with it, it will incite a second American Civil War.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey, for that question. Stephen, what do you think?
Well, the Project 2025 is really chilling. It's a horrifying document to read. I don't know how fully Trump will follow it. He may not even know that he's following it when he appoints people to produce it. Just the fact that it's out there, though, gives you a kind of a framework for the worst case scenario. So I'll go back to something that I said during my talk. It's possible that Trump could be beneficial in some ways to the world, but I see him as being very dangerous inside the United States. That's my biggest worry. I mean, the United States has already become the wrecker of the world, but at least we preserved some semblance of democracy and freedom inside our own country. I'm worried about that now. And I'll tell you the one thing that I think is going to be the red line when you know that things are really going badly. Depending on your views on abortion or your views on the urgency of climate change, maybe you could see Trump policy in not such a negative way. But there's one thing that autocrats always do, and it's the sign that they're slipping into serious repression, and that is when they start arresting their enemies. Then you know you've crossed the line. And I'm learning. I'm wondering if that's going to happen. I mean, all you have to do is listen to Trump during his campaign. And he says he wants to punish people that were against him. That's the beginning of the end. So when it comes to Project 2025, I say when I see that happening, that's when I think maybe I'll move to another level of rhetoric and maybe another level of something else.
Right, that is pretty scary stuff. Should we try, Brian, should we try Anatole again? What do you think?
We can try. I also suggested that if you'd like, you could write your question in the chat if we can't get your audio to work, Anatole. That way we can still, we'd be happy to read it for you. But while we figure that out, maybe we should go to one of the other folks.
Yeah, let's take Donald Smith.
Okay, hi. So first of all, please comment on what you think the effect of RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard will be on Trump? What do you expect? And the second question is, when George Beebe spoke here, he thought that over half of foreign policy experts, in the State Department or just the foreign policy world, actually agree that the U.S. provoked the war in Ukraine. But my interpretation is what they're afraid to say that. So I just want to know your opinion about me. Do members of Congress know that the U.S. provoked war in Ukraine, or are they brainwashed? That was my question. I don't know what you think about that, but I'm pretty sure you agree with me that the U.S. is lying big time about what happened there. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I agree with you that a lot of State Department diplomats are heartsick over this. Some have resigned, and I saw an interview with one of them who said, I know a lot of my friends would also resign, but they have families and they have jobs and they can't do that. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of discontent. In Congress, I'm not so sure, because State Department people have the job of learning about the world. Members of Congress don't do that. They can't even find Iran on a map. So yeah, they are, you use the word brainwashed. I think they're just mindlessly repeating this as long as it takes, or ironclad forever rhetoric that they get. It feels good. It's kind of macho. It feels American. And a lot of these people grew up hating the Soviet Union, and they think they can get it back at the Soviet Union, and maybe we can even depose Stalin if we keep working on this. That's the level that they're at. You also asked about Robert Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. So they did become kind of public figures in the Trump campaign in the last couple of months. Whether they're really in the inner circle of Trumpites, Trump world, I'm not so sure. I've always liked Tulsi because of her foreign policy views, and I don't think those have changed, even though she's had quite a political catharsis over recent months, over the last year or two. So I hope that it's true that she's responsible for kicking Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo out of contention for jobs in the Trump administration. And if she's still kicking, then I'm all for it. Kick some more. As for Robert Kennedy, I find him a kind of a less appealing figure. I supported him for about 12 hours when he first announced. And I can tell you the whole story. I remember the first thing I saw when he said he was going to run for president was a tweet in which he said that Roger Waters, the musician, had a great view of the Middle East, and I support him 100%. And I thought, wow, Roger Waters, he's a big campaigner for Palestine. And Robert Kennedy supports him. Hey, maybe I'm going to like this guy. The next day, Robert Kennedy tweeted another picture of himself with several rabbis and saying it was all a mistake. Now I find out what Roger Waters believes, and now I'm against it all. So that was a very short-lived romance. I'm also pretty terrified about the idea that we should stop vaccinating children against disease. I mean, it's like taking it back to the era of leeches and bleeding. So I fear the influence of wacko internet theories coming into the positions of power if Trump really gives Robert Kennedy responsibility for public health. I'm not so sure that's going to happen any more than I think it's going to happen that Tulsi Gabbard will be given responsibility for foreign policy. But nobody's sure about anything with this guy, so let's wait and see.
Okay, let's try Anatole again. I see him in a different box up here. Let's see if this one works better.
Unmute. Can you
You're all
hear me
set.
now?
We can hear you.
Well, hallelujah. Stephen, I belong to the group that hold the signs in support of peace in Israel, in Palestine. But I cannot find any group at all that would support the peace in Ukraine. All right. So, so now that situation is changing, maybe you know, maybe Brown University have some people who would do some discuss. I have some ideas. I was born in Ukraine, and I have some ideas how to how to bring the same people, the same religion together.
Well, I have to say that you're right. You know, you made an interesting point that everybody's so mobilized on the Gaza issue, and there's no organized peace movement comparable in size or intensity for Ukraine. I think that might have been different if Gaza hadn't happened. I think a lot of that energy might have been poured into stopping the Ukraine war, but the one in Gaza, in some ways, even worse because America is supplying so much of the weaponry. So I have to tell you that you asked me about my job at Brown University. I don't notice any difference among my colleagues. I'm still unpopular. I mean, I'm still in the small minority. I just got an email from one of my colleagues just in the last couple of days criticizing something I'd written and saying that Putin is never going to stop. He has to be completely defeated, and Ukraine is never going to allow the country to be liquidated. So I really think that it's going to take a while for the changing narrative to filter down. But the changing narrative has to be the beginning, and we're seeing that now. So I'm noticing, like, The Economist, which loves every war ever, even had a story saying Russian troops are slicing through a Ukrainian defense system. That was their phrase. I don't think they would have said that even a few weeks ago. These reports are not based on what's happening on the ground. They're all based on what's the narrative supposed to be these days. So when I see reports suddenly saying that Ukrainian forces aren't doing so well, I don't feel like that's a sudden change on the ground. It's just a sudden change in what we're supposed to be hearing. So I'm with you waiting for the Ukraine peace movement. I would say that Ukraine is an easier one to solve than Gaza. If you ask me what would be the ideal long-term solution for Israel and Gaza, boy, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Ukraine and Russia, it's much easier to imagine what a solution would be. And that's why I'm hoping that common sense can prevail there. And I think it's going to happen before common sense prevails in Gaza.
And they print you at the Boston Globe, so there is something coming.
Yeah,
Something
well,
working for you.
they print some things. There's a lot of things I'd like to say that you don't get to read in the Globe, and that's why I come to speak to you.
There are several articles by you over the years about
Good. Well, I'm
Russia.
glad you're reading them, and somebody's out there on the receiving end.
Anatole, I have a message directly for you. Massachusetts Peace Action has had a Ukraine peace movement for the last 5 years, or actually since 5 years, since before the war began, and we have had some fairly decent sized demonstrations at which Stephen has actually spoken. It's too small. Naturally, you want everyone to be focused on Gaza, given the horrendous slaughter going on there every day.
Yeah.
But this is the time where there is some talk now of the need for negotiations. This is the time for everyone who sees the horror of what this war is and how much lies have been told to sell this war to come out and do whatever they can, whether letters to the editor or whatever. I just put our somewhere I think I put our link to our campaign in the chat, and we would certainly welcome your involvement in it. So hang in there. We got a movement to get going there.
I'll join you next time. Yeah,
that'd be great, Anatole. Go ahead, Stephen.
Let me just add one thing. As one of the guests commented, I said that the situation in Gaza is even more urgent for Americans because Americans are supplying all the weapons. It's also true that the United States is providing most of the weapons for Ukraine. So I understand that countries are warlike and countries are doing the kind of things that the United States has been doing for many generations. But I don't like the United States to be the one that's providing the weaponry. And I think, to me, that's the key, rather than hoping that people in other parts of the world will change their minds. Let's just stop sending them guns and then allow the people in the countries in the region to come to their own accord without putting America's thumb on the scale. Let them accomplish their own security architecture. The only way there's going to be peace in the Middle East over the long run is a security architecture in the region in which every country feels that their interests are taken into account. The exact same thing is true in Ukraine and in all of Europe. The only time there's going to be stability in Europe is if there's a European security architecture that takes into account the security interests of all countries. The United States hates this idea. We don't want a security architecture in the Middle East that takes into account Iran's concerns, or a security architecture in Europe that takes into account Russia's security concerns. But I think that's the way we have to go if we want to settle these regions down over the longer term.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Let's go to Tom Green.
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering if you'd comment on the reports today that U.S. jets bombed Houthi locations in Yemen. That just seems like an escalation that's not something I think is very positive.
So I think this is just another one of these last gasps for Biden. I mean, it's really amazing. The guy cannot stop bombing, even as a lame duck. He can't restrain himself from bombing other countries. You know, we call that force that we hate in Yemen the Houthis. Actually, we should call it Yemen. It's Yemen. They control 80% of the country, and the so-called recognized president of Yemen has been living in Saudi Arabia and hasn't been inside Yemen for 10 years. So the Houthis are Yemen, and they're part of a reality that we're going to have to deal with. So really, I find it just awful that Biden, at this late date, even after losing the election, largely because he was bequeathing his war policy to Kamala Harris, who embraced it, is now, even in his last days as president, going to still want to go out and bomb. And if you ever had any doubt about Biden's approach to the world, this resolves it.
Yeah, it's very frightening, and it would seem it would take the U.S. would prevent the U.S. from being a diplomatic force there, or any kind of negotiations now in Gaza. The U.S. has kind of put themselves out of consideration, I would think.
I mentioned earlier the phrase diplomacy-free foreign policy. That's definitely what we're following with Yemen.
Yeah, it's a tragedy, especially with what Yemen has been through over the last dozen years or so. Let's take a question from Peter, and this is the last question we're going to take, and then I'm going to, as the moderator here, ask one last one. So let's have Peter Schultz.
Sure, thank you. Dr. Kinzer, your books are fantastic. Overthrow and The Brothers, about the Dulles brothers. I love those books. I recommend them to everyone. But in any case, just a quick question. The United Nations has been frustrated by the United States continuing to veto all resolutions condemning Israel about anything. Do you think there's any hope for this idea of the other nations of the world overruling the Security Council and doing something that could make a difference in Gaza?
I don't see that policy in the short run because of the power of the Security Council. I do think that Gaza has reflected the weakness of the United Nations. It doesn't matter that 90% of the nations in the world believe something. If the United States doesn't like it, it doesn't happen. That's called the rules-based order, which is the opposite of international law. So if the UN wants to avoid sinking into irrelevancy, certainly the Security Council and the General Assembly, they have to find a way to evolve. We have a real institutional deficit in this world. The institutions that are governing the world were set up in a different era to deal with a different reality. And the world has changed so much since then, but these institutions seem immovable. There are now efforts to expand the Security Council, which I think would be a good idea, like expanding the Supreme Court. And I can only finish by telling you, you have great taste in literature. Thanks.
Yeah, those books really are terrific. That one on Iran, boy, what a story. Okay, Stephen, I want to ask your thoughts on how we thread the needle on climate change. It just seems that Trump is determined to make sure that the planet experiences total climate catastrophe. Do you see any openings here? Can we win over some of his supporters? We don't have 4 years. We just don't have 4 years.
Well, this is really a perplexing question. I would have wished that Kamala Harris had answered the question, what's America's greatest challenge in the world? Not said it was Iran, but said it was climate change. That would have, how many votes would that have won? It would have woken people up. It would have woken me up. If you're a single issue voter and your issue is climate change, then you have a good reason to vote for Kamala Harris. If your single issue is foreign policy, then no. But if your issue is the environment and climate change, there's one where Democrats are better. So it's pretty scary. I agree with you to see Trump effectively dismissing the reality that faces us. But he's not a person that's grown up by accepting reality anyway. I think that the Trump policies will be quite negative. Let's wait and see what Congress can do. But I think a lot of these negative impacts will come from regulation changes in which Congress has no say. I do think, however, that the rest of the world is going in the opposite direction from the United States. I sense a growing understanding of the depth of this problem. And most particularly, I think the country that's changed the most on this is China. The Chinese have now gotten to the point where they take climate change very seriously. And they are major emitters. And they have such influence through their foreign aid projects all over the world. So I think China might be playing the role that we would like the United States to play, of being the leader in climate change. And maybe China can hold off the catastrophe that the United States is continuing to promote. I agree with you, though, that this is a really serious problem. I would put it up there with nuclear war as the two greatest threats, bigger than Ukraine, bigger than Gaza. Those are threats to all humanity. So my ideal president would say that I'm identifying those two threats and I'm going to confront them. But I don't see that happening. So I do think it's important for people like us that work on foreign policy and geopolitics also understand that climate change is geopolitics writ large. So there can't be any real substantial foreign policy approach that's positive if it's not affecting climate change. I would love to see all countries look at the world through that lens. I don't think the United States is going to be doing that. It all, again, depends on personnel, but other countries are. So in China, there's no legislature that you can lobby. You can't criticize the government. On the other hand, they tend to be very smart people and make some good decisions. So I think I really appreciate your ending with this because we don't want to lose focus on that issue. Even when the Gaza war ends and the Ukraine war ends, these two big problems, climate change and the possibility of nuclear war, will remain. Maybe the nuclear war danger will decrease if the Ukraine war is settled, but the climate change danger is not going to decrease. And it's something we all need to bear in mind, and we have to think about how we can get together and see what we can do to deal with this question, which is so overwhelming, not just for us, but for all humanity.
Yeah. Stephen, thank you so very, very much for your comments, for your time, for your writing. please, please keep writing things. And it's really a breath of fresh air when we see something that you write in the Globe. So thanks a million. Just ask everyone here to keep an eye on the events page of the Massachusetts Peace Action website. There's all kinds of events coming up on Gaza that hopefully you will participate in, and most importantly, get involved in these issues, as many of you, of course, already are. There's a lot of work to do, but we've got to figure out our way to get through all this. So, Stephen, thanks a million. And we will be doing a follow-up email to everybody, giving you a link to tonight's program, a link to the recording, as well as a few links, such as the video that we showed at the very beginning, in the hope that you might be able to use it, and also a link to how to join the Ukraine campaign.
Well, thank you all, and don't mourn, organize.
I've heard that.